More than clumps of idle stone, cities are nexuses for adventure. They are the hubs by which our adventurers find friends, allies, enemies, and new quests. They are the place by which our heroes rest and then venture forth into the realms of the unknown, and since the medieval times, they have been places that have shaped history. But today on Desks and Dorks, we are going to talk all about medieval cities. Hello everybody, my name is Kyle, I am the Dork, you're watching Desks and Dorks. A few things, all of the YouTube pleasantries would certainly help us if you feel like doing those. A link to the Discord is in our description below, but if you want the single best way to assist both myself and the people that I pay to keep the lights on, then the best way to do so is to get notified for our Kickstarter for A Fear Within, a rules-light, horror-driven tabletop role-playing game that is Pokemon by way of Stephen King. In this game, you will play as children and the literal monsters that possess them, fighting against an eldritch force called the Fear, a unique being shaped by your GM every time that you play. Again, best way to do it is to get notified, even if you are not in a financial position to do so, as getting notified bumps us up in Kickstarter's algorithm and recommends us to folks that might support the game. With that out of the way, let's talk about medieval cities. As always, I'm going to begin with a couple caveats. I was trained as a medievalist. However, in spite of my medieval history degree, I was trained as a Western medievalist, and thus most of my research was Eurocentric. That means that I will be focusing mostly on Western Europe during the Middle Ages, and in this video, during the Renaissance. Although that was not my focus, I count several very prominent Renaissance scholars as mentors and former teachers of mine, particularly Dr. Greg Murray, who is a Fulbright scholar and is a provost over at Mount St. Mary's University. Fun fact, that guy, despite having a record in Renaissance history, is the dude that helped me design my first games. I co-taught a class on games and history with him. So while I did not focus in it, I do have plenty of mentors and a reasonable amount of understanding with this. Now, I bring this up because the other parts of the world during the Middle Ages are incredible, and they are worth interacting with and engaging with. Those topics, those places, those cultures are important. However, I am going to leave them out because I feel like I do not have the nuance, understanding, and expertise to approach those topics with the respect that those times and cultures deserve. Finally, we will be mentioning right here and right now that if you're going to engage in the darker elements of the medieval period, you probably want to be running some safety tools. Usually, I make its own explicit slide. However, for our presentation today, because we're focusing on the formation of geographic and, shall we say, structurally or human-shaped areas rather than the activities that take place therein, I decided to leave it out. But again, if you're going to do those things, you probably should have safety tools to make sure that your players are comfortable at the table. This is going to be what we're covering. Let's get into it, and let's start with misconceptions. But the first misconception is very simple, and it's one that I think is driven by modern sensibility, and that is the idea that medieval cities were planned. When we walk through the streets of New York, it's easy to see the grid-like pattern, but the reality is that medieval cities formed slowly, and I would argue you could even say naturally, based on the location and the need. Now that might not make a lot of sense, but I want you to close your eyes for a second and then picture the medieval fishing village. A medieval fishing village, a place that has been established to A, give its residents access to food, and B, serve as a small hub of trade. Excellent spots on rivers, large lakes, or on the coasts of land would actually, slowly, over a period of hundreds of years, begin to grow both in size and prominence as traders decided to settle down, as more experienced artisans decided this was a good place to set up shop, as families who benefited from the wealth, food, and resources that this trade provided began to grow and expand, both in terms of their number and in terms of how much of the environmental space they took up. Over time, these small fishing outposts and villages would often become cities, and it's hard for me to overstate how important that cities and bodies of water are in their relationship to one another. One of the things that we talk pretty frequently about is that after the fall of the Roman Empire, logistics and travel were very difficult tasks to accomplish. Travel was dangerous and slow, but having access to large navigable rivers made it so that it was possible that you, as a merchant or traveler, could travel swiftly and relatively safely in comparison to the rest of the medieval world. This is one of the things that is absolutely critical about these river-based or coastal-based or even large lake-based towns. That made them very important. Again, not just as hubs of trade, but as places that traders could get to without having to worry about life and limb. Another thing that's really important about these sections is their ability to defend themselves. Remember, in addition to giving access to easy ingress and egress from a place, rivers, the coast, and lakes make it entirely possible and plausible that you have an extra layer of defense. After all, it's much easier to stab a man with a spear when he's trying to slog up the riverbank than it is if he's just running at you on flat, dry land. And this actually brings me to another wonderful reason and way that towns would form, and that is for defense. Now, some towns and cities actually formed due to natural defenses. We mentioned rivers, but cliff sides and mountains, cliff tops, for example, or in some cases, major plateaus, if we're looking at medieval area cities in other locations outside of Europe, are all plausible. But one of the things that I think is most interesting is often a castle is the sole nexus point for the development of a city. In fact, we have numerous occasions in medieval history where a motte and bailey or a hill fort was the central point by which a town or city forms. Basically, what would happen is you would build a large defensible point. People would congregate around that point because they knew they would be safe, again, to conduct trade, but also to conduct their lives. Farmers could flee there in the event that their fields were being raided, or soldiers could sally forth and push back raiders or invaders from those lands. Gradually, as more and more people learned to flock to this location or a location of this sort for their safety and for commerce, gradually it started to grow. After all, you need people to grow your food, and then of course you need people to fix their tools, and then you need people to entertain the people that continue to live there, and then you need midwives and you need herbalists to help continue to heal the sick and help deliver the babies that continue to pop out in your large and growing and prosperous town. I think it's really interesting to look at a castle or a hill fort or even a well-defended outpost as a kind of seed or a root system by which a city germinates and moves out. The second misconception here is that cities did not change dynamically. This, I think, is shall we say, an artifact of our modern way of thinking. Our cities change dynamically. Anybody that has attempted to drive through New York City or drive through urban New Jersey at any point here in the United States can probably vouch for that pretty well. Roads that were functioning one day might not be functioning the next, and it's possible that a single visit from a city inspector could close down your favorite restaurant. But this is entirely true for cities during the medieval period as well. They could change drastically and dramatically in weeks, months, and even in days. The biggest culprit of this is, of course, fire. One of the things that you have to realize is that when we talk about the medieval period, a lot of times there are two big things working against the structures included in those main urban areas. The first, of course, is the proximity of buildings. They would have been built close together because, again, everyone is trying to hide behind the protective walls or protective features of a defended city. And also the building material. You have to consider that a lot of daub or thatch is used, and that many different types of medieval structures can go up like a light. Also, there is a lack of firefighting practices in the Middle Ages. One of the big issues with the Middle Ages is that there isn't a professional firefighting force, certainly not like the ones that we enjoy today in the modern era. It would have been far more common for individuals who had to, have access to volunteer time to be able to look out for the city during those moments. And in sieges, this also would have been common as well, with fire brigades being created by non-combatants, women and children, while a walled area or whatever castle you were occupying was under attack. But a professional firefighting force does not come into play until much, much later, to the detriment of the medieval city and everyone living in it. Another big issue, and one that often doesn't get talked about enough, is lightning and its role in those medieval cities. This was such an issue that it persisted long into colonial times, and again, it runs counter to another little mini misconception that I've sort of buried here, which is that siege or, a cow knocking over a lantern, for example, cough, cough, Great Chicago Fire, cough, cough, is the main culprit of those fires. But in many cases, lightning storms and errant weather is a huge risk to the medieval city. Remember, my friends, that lightning and storms are that much of a threat because the lightning rod wasn't invented until about 1752, and its use did save hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of lives over the first couple years of its inception. I'm also going to throw in a bonus fact for all of you. Now, oftentimes the lightning rod and its invention are accredited or attributed to Mr. Benjamin Franklin, one of the US's founding fathers. However, that is absolutely not true. The original person who actually helped to create the grounding system that would have attached to the lightning rod, the system by which it runs into the earth and thus neutralizes its powerful electric charge, was a Czech priest named Prokop Divish, and I hope that I'm saying that correctly. I looked that pronunciation up several different times, so if you are Czech in the comments below or are trained in the Czech language, please feel free to correct me. I'm doing my darndest. Moving on from the lightning storms. Again, the biggest threats, though, aren't just from weather. One of the biggest threats is construction. You have to understand that during the Middle Ages, stone quarrying was a dangerous and hazardous process, even more so than it is today. We still have workplace accidents, injuries, and deaths related to the process of stone quarrying, and in the Middle Ages, this would have been equally true. These difficulties are then doubled over by the fact that there is, again, say it with me, a lack of cohesive infrastructure in some places, making it difficult for you to transport large quantities of stone needed to construct things. So what is a good medieval peasant or good medieval noble looking to construct new buildings, a wall, a church, something that the peasants can remember as part and parcel to your glory? What is someone like that to do? Well, the answer is you start ripping them down from other structures. This happens actually a few times in primary sources and even more in the anecdotal sources that I could find, where castles that were just simply no longer in use or essentially cannibalized for stone. Again, this also would have been fairly common in ancient ruins. We have examples in medieval and Renaissance Rome of actual monuments from the glory days of the Roman Empire being stripped for parts. We lost entire aqueduct systems, and actually a small percentage of the Roman Colosseum and the Circus Maximus were used to actually construct other buildings. It's absolutely wild and crazy. So it's not totally common for castles, but ruins, older buildings, and again, military structures no longer in use. I did mention it before. We do have a couple castles where that was an example, but it's mostly these three main structures. So again, a ruin that maybe your players are hiding out in or stashed their treasure in one session could very easily be transferred into a different building. It would be kind of cool, by the way, as a small adventure idea, to maybe have a cursed or sentient stone in one building be transferred to another one, and then have the players actually engage in a bit of a manhunt across the city for a single cursed brick. I think that'd be kind of neat. But now we move to what life was like in a medieval city, and for the first time in Desks and Dorks, I'm going to do what I like to call a historical juxtaposition. So many of you in the comments asked about me taking historical concepts and applying them directly as a one-to-one to characters so that you could use those ideas for NPCs, for world building, or for lore in your own games. And while I love that idea, I don't think it works perfectly well. I don't think there's any way that you can take historical concepts and make a one-to-one recreation of them without losing quite a lot of the nuance. But what I loved about your idea was that I think it draws an interesting parallel. If we take a great example in fiction and we apply it to history and we bounce back and forth between those examples, I think we can find something really exciting. So before I introduce our major city in fantasy that we're going to be looking at and how it holds up to core concepts of what medieval city life was like, let's talk about the first core concept, and that is that cities, especially the big ones, had spheres of influence that expanded long beyond the last borders of their town. They had reach that stretched out to grasp others from beyond its walls or beyond its final buildings on the borders of town. And in order for us to talk about this, there is one city that I think does a fantastic job of embodying a lot of the medieval historical, shall we say, themes, and really kind of twisting them in a way that makes for an effective backdrop for fantasy gaming. Allow me to introduce you to Novigrad, a brief primer on Novigrad for those who are not attached to the Witcher franchise in the same ways that I am. Cough, cough, it was my computer background for like 10 years. Novigrad is a city sort of beset on all sides by power. It is being occupied by an invading force of a king. It is possessed of a massive amount of religious upheaval. It is, of course, the location that our main character takes his adventure to. It has a vast criminal underground and several different criminal elements running in the city, as well as creatures of myth and legend, all hobnobbing and rubbing shoulders with your average peasantry and members of what would have been a medieval middle class and the upper crust in the form of the nobility. Novigrad is a wonderful little melting pot, and I think it does a great job of embodying several different characteristics that I found that were essential to talking about a medieval town. Novigrad is a really interesting example for a couple different reasons. One, because it proves our point about those naturally occurring bodies of water being used as a site to establish an important city. You'll notice a man-made harbor in the bottom left-hand corner, and if you're a savvy watcher, you'll see those gray and green areas. That's the actual land, which means that Novigrad is a man-made harbor area with navigable canals built inside a naturally occurring harbor area, making this a prime example of tradeception, a trading harbor within a trading harbor. But one of the things that I wanted to do with Novigrad, and part of the reason I give you a smaller map before I give you a larger one, is it's important for you to understand the city's layout before we talk about its spheres of influence. I went back through and I played a little bit of the game, and you'll notice those X's are areas where either important roads are or where areas of bodies of water are that can be either reached or accessed by Novigrad or the towns around it. That is really interesting. Those yellow X's, by the way, and how I measured a sphere of influence, obviously there's no political mechanic in The Witcher, but those yellow X's are areas where I either marked environmental storytelling features, like people dressed in Novigrad clothing, or marked conversations, people talking about the impact that Novigrad had on their daily life, or what they were going to do when they either get to Novigrad or what they did before they decided to leave Novigrad. I marked with an X, as those are evidence that Novigrad culture and Novigrad ideas are starting to seep out. Again, if you venture all the way down to that other structure at the bottom of the map, that is the Baron's Fort. The Baron has numerous examples of conversation where he discusses the importance of Novigrad and its larger role to play in the war to come. But this is an interesting juxtaposition because it brings us, my dear friends, to medieval Paris, or Paris if you prefer. Now, Paris is a wonderful example for Novigrad because, much like its fantasy counterpart, it is built with navigable canals on a river, it is built to be defensible, and it is a hub of trade with a vast sphere of influence. Nowhere is this more clear than in the royal domain, or by its actual proper name, the Ile-de-France, which is a name for the area surrounding Paris that was controlled by the Carolingians. Much like Novigrad, Paris was an important area for trade and also for culture, but also like Novigrad, it finds itself sandwiched in between enemies, and the city being used as a foundation by which its ruling class is able to establish power. Remember, it's difficult for someone, especially early medieval monarchs, to expand their sphere of influence very far outside the cities. The navigable rivers that France is built on, the Seine, are an important part of that. As the Carolingians are able to sort of expand their influence to other places, the Ile-de-France is able to expand, and if things go poorly, they are always able to retreat to an area like Paris by which to lick their wounds and try again later. Novigrad is caught in between two prominent forces, Redania, a northern monarchy in the north, and Nilfgaard, an invading empire in the south. The Ile-de-France is actually also caught between enemies. That Duchy of Normandy, by the way, is the original holding of William, Duke of Normandy, who later goes on to conquer England. It is by his French birthright as Duke that the English will later come several different times to France in an attempt to exert a claim over the country, plunging it into hundreds of years of warfare. Other French places, like of course the County of Anjou, are going to be hostile toward the Parisian government and to the Carolingians in general. Remember, in the Middle Ages, it would have been entirely possible and plausible to share some culture with somebody, but even then, still view them as an enemy or as a threat to your political or economic ambitions. And so, because the Carolingians have the ability to just retreat back to Paris and use it as a home base, becomes an essential part and facet not just of their dynasty, but of their survival, and thus the trajectory of French history as a whole. Now, again, it's really important for us to talk about another feature of medieval city life, and it's often that big ones, important ones, had multiple different groups vying for political and military power. In Novigrad, I did mention the Redanians earlier, but now I get to mention them a little bit more. The Redanians are a northern monarchy that are essentially fighting for the quote-unquote survival of the north. In reality, it is a war not just for survival, but a war that will allow their king to expand his influence to the other, more broken areas of the continent. This means, and under this circumstance, the Redanian military occupies parts of Novigrad. Ostensibly, it is to protect the city from the Nilfgaardians in the south. In reality, it's to soften the city up. Remember, it is an important trade hub, cultural hub, and very, 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 very important area in the history and the lore of The Witcher, and Radovid, King of Redania, wants it for himself. Now, the city government knows that they can't, get rid of, or shall we say, expel the Redanian forces. They're not strong enough to do so, but they also know that Radovid, and thus the Redanian army, can't risk an outright war with them when Nilfgaard is at the doorstep from the south. This fraught military position is then, of course, added to with a fraught religious position. You see, the dominant faith in Novigrad does not take too kindly to the Redanian occupation, and they also don't take too kindly to what they perceive as the city's moral failings, and thus the lay people, spurred on by faith and cough members of the militant church, begin to arm themselves, not just in an effort to get rid of the Redanians, but mostly to get rid of non-humans, magic users, and anyone they think is a threat to their safety. This group, by the way, is very reminiscent of a group that you will meet a little bit later, but adding to all of this is the criminal element of the city. Numerous prominent business leaders, or in one case, a prominent church leader, are involved in criminal enterprises, with their gangs being heavily armed, well incentivized, because remember, the city offers them not just wealth and livelihood, but a home, and also more than ready to crack skulls and commit acts of unremoval of someone from the life stream at their earliest convenience. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting, and one of the inspirations for Novigrad, was the city of Florence, a city that is rife with beauty, art, culture, and architecture, but also a city that is rife with horrifying levels of factional intrigue. One of the things that I love about Florence, and I'm going to pause very quickly to draw your attention to, oh my gosh, navigable bodies of water in a defensible region. Wow, it's all so interesting that this trading hub eventually evolved to become the city-state of Florence. Really crazy how that worked out. But again, it's important for us to mention these things because these factions would go on to actually help inspire, and in many ways shape, the factions of Novigrad. On the one hand, you have the important and powerful nobility that occupy the city and their own personal bodyguards. You can find out more, by the way, on how to construct a noble bodyguard in the video we did on town guards. It's pretty good if I do say so myself, but in the case of Florence, it's the Medici, the Rosari, and the Strozzi. These are prominent members of Florentine industry. In the Medici's case, we'll use them as an example. They occupy a very important role in Italian banking. Compounding the presence of these forces was the force or the religious army of the pontiff, the Pope themselves. Now, the Pope doesn't always have occupying armies in Florence or occupying military forces in Florence, but it wouldn't have been uncommon for him to keep regiments of soldiers there, not just to protect his secular interests, but also to exert a little bit of authority. This is especially true, by the way, when the Medici have a Pope of their own that was a Medici and is then placed into power. It's also not uncommon when there were popes from other prominent Italian families who didn't like the Medicis and, of course, decided to, throw their weight around a little bit, for Jesus. And last but certainly not least, we have to talk about the Piagnoni. This was a group of well-armed, disenfranchised young men that followed a radical monk named Friar Savonarola. Now, on the surface, this is a religious group. They believed that there was corruption in the church. They believed that arts, and culture were a threat to the soul, and as such began burning musical instruments, art pieces, sculptures, sometimes artists and musicians as well, in an attempt to cleanse Florence of what they believed was a moral corruption and degradation. The issue is that in many cases, this is a smokescreen for them to enact acts of widespread theft and violence that they likely would have wanted to do in the first place. This is one of the reasons that I think Florence and Novigrad are wonderful bedfellows. Both cities are possessed by several powerful factions, all of whom are vying for political and economic power and superiority with their own unique motives, characters, and leadership styles. Again, Florence was one of the inspirations for Novigrad in the game, and it's easy to see why, as these disparate groups sort of vie for power in violent and often unexpected ways. Creating factions like this in your city doesn't just make it more lived in and more believable, it also adds ample opportunities for role-playing, combat, and intrigue for your players to engage in, and I ultimately think that it is both a necessary part of creating cities like this for your games, but it's also a necessary way to make them more historically accurate, or at the very least, more historically inclined. But now that we've talked about the makeup of the sorts of factions that you would find in an urban setting, either in real life or in games, let's continue on by talking about something that I think gets overlooked, and that is labor. Because cities developed slowly and naturally over the course of a city's history and its lifespan, citizens or groups in that city tended to congregate together. And the reason I want to talk about labor is, as a historian, one of my favorite things ever is memes. I think memes are actually brilliant and in many ways are going to be, I think, one of the most important vehicles for how we as a civilization, as a species, spread information. And I'm not even joking. I don't even think that's conjecture. I think that's actually just going to be what happens. And it got me thinking about this particular meme right here. I think if you are in a certain sphere in a certain space, you have most likely seen this meme. The idea that medieval peasants really work less time than us. And on the surface, that is actually true, right? A medieval peasant with access to all of its religious holidays, or their religious holidays, I should say, is able to work less days, but it doesn't take into account the nuances of the actual work that they were doing. Unfortunately, real life is, unlike memes, usually far more nuanced with a lot more areas of gray, and so we have to talk about what labor was like. You see, labor did really look different in pre-industrial times, and in fact it wasn't uncommon for medieval families and medieval peasants to take their work home with them, something that my fellow white-collar job people probably know if you've ever been like, wow, I've worked a full day, can't wait to take all these reports home with me, that sounds like it's super good and excellent for my mental health. But in many cases, it was true for the medieval peasants. Work that could not be done outside in the dark, in the fields, or somewhere else on their fief would actually be taken back home and done around the table, around the fire, or with the family. And in many cases, those children in that medieval household would usually participate in this kind of night work. Over time, as those children grew to adulthood and as the communities around them grew, it gave form to communities of laborers. Again, it's not hard to imagine these children over long periods of time developing skills at particular parts of the trade. One of my favorite primary sources, and unfortunately I tried to look it up to see if I could find it again, but it was one that I read during my college days, talks about the life and family of a rope baker, and over time, certain children being better at certain types of rope making as a result of continuing to do it with their father during the nighttime after the work was done in the fields. Again, as the communities sort of formed around them, these individuals would form sections or at least neighborhoods where people of similar skills would congregate and gather. And I think this is part of the inspiration for the guild district in a fantasy game. It's really not hard to imagine these sorts of like-minded and like-skilled people forming together, either through familial bonds or professional ones, and it also makes sense that if you wanted to take part in that trade, you would attempt to marry into that family, or at the very least, get into proximity with those people so that you could get good at what they are getting good at. It really does all boil down to classic Dark Souls logic. It's all about trying to get good. Now, this does change, however, with the introduction of guilds. In many ways, guilds were the, how do I put this gently, the formal way of commodifying and streamlining this process. Once medieval guilds come into play, they help to either, again, help people outside of familial bonds get those particular skills, but they also act as a kind of quality assurance and as well a kind of police force where they sort of weed out bad actors. And unlike other organizations that are supposed to police themselves, cough cough town guards, cough cough, the medieval guilds have a vested interest in getting rid of bad apples and getting rid of bad actors. Seriously, their entire life and livelihood depends on people buying their goods, their crafts, their things that they actually generate. And if a guild gets a bad reputation for shoddy workmanship, not only will they stop making money, I have a couple of different cases where they were actually just sort of forced out of town, forced to give up their guild license, punished in courts of law, or in many cases just had to flee or go into exile in order to avoid crowds of angry customers. So again, guilds, despite some of the things that they might do that were not great, like rising prices or sort of forcing out smaller versions of themselves. Again, it's a lot of the problems that we have with modern business, actually do some good for helping these crafts out, and according to a lot of the sources, do a pretty decent job of policing themselves. Again, it's a little bit different when, if you fail to generate a useful product and someone else dies, instead of it going to a court of law, there's a chance that somebody might want to turn your skull into a drinking glass. Now, again, that doesn't happen to quite that extreme, at least not in the sources that I read, but it is fun to imagine the idea that there is a guild troubleshooter or guild quality assurance that is very, very worried and very concerned about ticking off the night next door. I think that's kind of neat. And it's neat to mention or think about that night next door, because the truth of the matter is that guilds don't work like their own independent districts controlling politics from the scenes, although sometimes they did play a very, very pivotal role in local politics, but not in the way that fantasy games usually portray them. No, in fact, guilds and city craftspeople usually just kind of work like a modern corporation. Yes, it is often that they would congregate together in buildings called guild halls, and that sometimes a single guild would have multiple buildings. However, in most of the research that I did, it seems pretty clear that these buildings, these guilds, these craftspeople would be interspersed and living their lives among the regular citizenry. This means that individuals of every social strata would have been moving around in some way, shape, or form and interacting with one another in cities. And this actually does get borne out as we talk about the development of Europe and medieval politics. In fact, cities become the melting pot for many of the ideas that would lay the foundations for modern democratic movements. It's actually really critical to think about cities not just as cultural melting pots, but political ones as well. And the reason those ideas were able to spread effectively across social classes is because the wealthier or more well-established merchants in many cases interacted not just with nobles, but with the lower class and the peasantry as well. And that spread of ideas and that hard look at how the other side lives on all fronts is what helped to shape and push major social change. You should not be isolating, if you are building a city, should not be isolating your guilds in their own independent trade districts. Instead, I want you to think of them like a business annex. Seriously, if you've ever driven past a strip mall in the 90s, that had like a small office building, a Kinko's, a coffee shop, and then, I don't know, some other random building or corporate-centric, corporate-based business all in one little tiny strip mall, it's more like that than its own independent district. Again, these were clusters of structures with people of similar skills all working together to get a craft done, and it makes a lot of sense, right, to think of it less as a independent district and more of its own little independent annex or group of buildings. Again, I'm just going to keep calling it a medieval business strip mall because it's kind of what it is. Now, again, you don't want a big district because that's a lot of overhead, that's a lot of responsibility, but you do want to congregate all of your experienced and important workers together so that they can collaborate on the jobs that they need to, and so that they have the space to do their tasks effectively. Again, the modern guild district, as it is pertained in fantasy media, is a, how do I put this gently, a mutation, a variation, an aberration of these real, actual practices. Now, these types of things, guild cities, or I just pulled these offline, by the way, these are not from any specific game, but these cities, these types of guild districts are not just ahistorical, but they don't really work when you think about them practically. A guild would have to be of incredible power and significance to purchase its own city or its own independent district. In my research, I could think of only a few different guilds that actually would have been able to do so, and one of them, the Medici, is also the de facto rulers of that entire city anyway. So, your average middle class or medieval middle class, I'm going to keep using that terminology. I know there's not technically a middle class in the Middle Ages, but again, you'll have to forgive me this little parallel. It's easier for me to use it in terms of our discussion. But this medieval middle class does not want, nor does it have the ability to control an entire district or city, but it does have the ability to sort of cordon off a couple well-to-do buildings scattered around a few different neighborhoods so that its workers can work together more effectively. Ravnica, the D&D setting, does this really poorly, I think. Now, granted, it does also assume that those guilds are no longer just people or craftsmen that have gathered together. They are socio-political entities unto themselves, so I will permit them, their little aberrations in the system. But again, it would have been uncommon for your regular low fantasy medieval guild to sort of have its own district. It would have been far more likely they would have been scattered around. But there's one other thing, and this is going to be conjecture from me. I'm going to mention that it is conjecture right now because I do not want to present it as fact. But as a game master, as somebody who writes games for a living, and as somebody who studies history because I love it, I think that this is actually springing from two things. The idea of the guild hall or the guild district as it pertains to fantasy media comes not just from these guild buildings or these guild annexes, but I think it also comes from a couple different places. One, cities often specialized in certain crafts. Now, that didn't mean that the city only does one craft. That would be silly. That would actually be really economically stupid, because if one industry goes down, everything else tanks. To use a non-medieval example, I live in Pennsylvania. I can probably take a 15 to 20 minute drive to a once prosperous town who has been absolutely gutted by the loss of coal production. Again, probably good for our environment in the long term, but it wasn't great for those individuals there because everybody specialized in that one craft, so cities usually diversified. The other thing, though, that I do think is interesting is that the cities that do specialize, like Flanders, for example, or London is actually a great example in terms of shipping and its maritime enterprises, becomes known for that one specific thing, despite having numerous industries that work around it. The other thing that I think helps inspire this is the idea of a market section in a medieval city. This would have been and is common all of those times that you see a giant shopping episode in like a fantasy anime or a fantasy video game. That's not actually too far from the truth. In many of these cities, there were either wide open spaces like the one pictured here, or far more narrow spaces, a series of large interconnected alleys where it would have been a ton of open air commerce. One of my favorite pieces of primary sources actually comes from one of the Crusades, where they talk about a sort of fast food section of Jerusalem where there are Muslim market stalls essentially hawking what would have passed for medieval fast food, and certain tourist guides are actually warned to not bring visitors to this section because they will get sick from the food. It's either of low quality or, more likely, the sources thought it was low quality, but more likely, knowing what we know in modern science, it's far more likely that food would have contained bacteria that the locals had been used to and that would have affected the sensitive gut biomes of the Europeans that were visiting the city. So again, I think this is really interesting, but I think this combination of guild annexes, cities that specialize in an individual trade, and these open air markets have sort of come together in the collective consciousness and the imagination of game masters, and they have become the fantasy guild district. It's easy to see why these things would have sort of melded together like some sort of medieval mercantile Voltron, but again, it makes sense. However, the guild district, as it is pertained in fantasy media, unfortunately, not a real thing, but you can play around with those concepts in your own fantasy cities. And again, The Witcher scores some points. If you spend any amount of time in Novigrad, you will realize that The Witcher actually gets to hobnob with members of every single social class, from the low peasants to the members of the guilds to, of course, the people who rule through religion or through nobility. And this is incredibly like one of the biggest and most important cities in medieval Europe. It's exactly like medieval London, which again had these sort of trade guilds and had a sort of, shall we say, chokehold on maritime trade endeavors, but again would have been a place that would have been a hotbed for the spread of ideas and the spread of culture, which I think is really neat. But now let's talk about a general overview of what life was like in cities, and this is going to be where I break away from Novigrad and The Witcher. Thanks, Witcher, for giving us a great example, but it's important for us to talk about this. But your quality of life is going to vary greatly depending on your social class in the medieval cities that you are in. Seriously, if you were a member of the lower class and you were part of a city, if you lost your job, if you were unable to work, if you were injured, then you wouldn't have been able to have a very good time. Chances are you probably would have dealt with starvation. And again, A lack of health and a lack of public order would have meant that you probably would have gotten sick. And in fact, if you were a middle class member, or again, what I'm going to dub the medieval middle class, which are those sort of tradesmen or those who have a craft that allows them to earn a pretty competitive wage, those individuals, those people tend to do pretty well for themselves in cities. And of course, as it mostly is in the medieval times, the nobility generally tend to fare well. However, as a general rule of thumb, and this is an oversimplification, but it is a pretty decent oversimplification, if you were living in a medieval city, you are trading longevity for opportunity. It's far more likely for you to rise above the station that you were born if you manage to get to a city. There's an apocryphal sort of myth, and I'm not entirely positive about its accuracy, but it does feel mostly apocryphal that if you were able to escape from your fief for a year and a day, you were given your freedom. Again, that would have been really hard to prove. It doesn't feel like that was totally accurate, but I do want to bring it up here because for many, a city offers both opportunity, freedom, and the allure of what could be as opposed to what is. And that I think is very important. Now, I'd say that you're trading longevity for opportunity because on the one side, you are dealing with things like disease and plague, and of course, the rise of rampant crime and those fires and those lightning storms that we mentioned. But again, this is a place for you to get an education, either a formal one or, most likely, if you were going to make your way up from a fief, an education in something nefarious, like the crimes, or an education as a tradesman or a laborer that was going to get paid far more and have the opportunity for social advancement, which is very, very important. It's easy for us to assume that cities are just sort of stagnant, but in reality, they offered an opportunity for people to rise above their station, and for many, that was totally worth the risk. But now that we've established what living in a medieval city is like, the things that sort of made it what it was, its idiosyncrasies, I think it's finally time for us to explore what it's going to be like to build one for ourselves. And shout out to Salty Nick over in the Desks and Dorks Discord who was like, is there a really low prep way to do this? And in fact, I think there is. So rather than give you specific examples like I have done in past videos, we're doing something else that's brand new for a Desks and Dorks video. We're going to generate this city on our own, and I've developed a pretty simple system for it. The first thing we need to establish is, of course, the stage that a city is at. If you've learned anything during this presentation, you'll know that a city slowly, gradually forms. And again, I would argue almost naturally forms as the people and communities that compose that city start to grow and change. So the first thing we need to do is figure out what stage a city is at. If it's forming, it's still a growing village. Again, it's on the cusp of being a city and, sort of evolving past, or at least shaking the cocoon of being a larger village. If it's a 3 to a 4, it's grown, established, but not totally massive. A 5 to 6 is a massive established city, something along the lines of London or Paris, for example. And so for our dice roll, we got a simple, humble 2. That means that our city is still forming, it is growing, it is in the nascent stages of becoming an urban area. The next thing that you need to do is think about those geographic features. And remember, folks, geographic features can be either naturally made or man-made. So for example, we could do a body of water like those rivers and lakes we talked about, but we could also do defensible positions like plateaus, cliffs, or mountaintops, or even a castle or a defensible position that's man-made, an outpost, for example. And for us, we got a 6, which means that we are dealing with a, shall we say, small growing village that is on the cusp of becoming a fully fledged city that is built around an outpost. And last but certainly not least, you need to check the stages of political upheaval within that city. On a 1 to 2, it is calm, 1 to 2 factions that have decent relations with each other. For example, if there is a political or religious homogeneity in that city, it does mean that you're probably going to have a degree of peace. A 3 or 4 means it is fractious. It means that these factions are beginning to move against one another to establish control of the city. And at a 5 to a 6, it is all out civil war, open hostility in the streets, which does in fact happen, not just in the medieval times, but hopefully in your games. So for our humble game, we rolled a 4, which means the beginnings of our city are starting to become rife with political and perhaps even military upheaval. So allow me to introduce you to Tendersford. Tendersford was a small fishing village until precious minerals and ores were discovered not just on the river banks, but in the base of the river itself. And what was once a prosperous fishing village has now turned into a booming settlement very, very quickly. Not only is this place a source for food and for precious metal, but its location as a trade hub around that original fishing outpost means that it has become very, very important in a very short amount of time. and its importance is starting to be overshadowed by the factions that populate it. The first are the king's outriders. Now, the king ostensibly has sent these soldiers to protect this town. The outriders are hard men, used to hard living, and of course are there to protect, and I say that in quotes, the town from the dangers of the frontier. However, these hard-fighting men and women are really truly there to exert the authority of the crown over what is steadily becoming a vital trade outpost and an essential artery for trade in the region. Compounding that are the fact that the fishermen in the village have a long-standing tradition and are incredibly proud not just of their roles in helping to make sure that the village is prosperous, but are now possessed of a lot of wealth. The first finders, or the first prospectors of that precious mineral, those precious ores, were not merchants or soldiers, they were the original fishermen, and those families, with their proud ancestral traditions stretching back to the town's original founding, have now combined that sense of pride with a lot of newfound wealth, and they are organizing to protect what they perceive is not only their way of life, but their original home from the people that would sort of try to change it or alter it in ways that make it unrecognizable to its original families. And last but certainly not least, where there is dubious amounts of gold, there is of course great economic opportunity. And Tendersford is now possessed by tons of merchants who have poured in from all corners of the realm, looking to capitalize on this booming settlement and its growth as a city as an opportunity for trade and wealth. These three factions are diametrically opposed in the futures that they see for Tendersford. The soldiers wish to bring it under their thumb. The fishermen wish to force the interlopers out and continue on a tradition with much more wealth. And the merchants seek to exploit it and to use their wealth to expand the settlement's borders and thus expand their profits. This is a really simple way for us to create towns. And again, your town, the way that you do this, it might look totally and completely different, but I think this is a really simple, good, low prep version and a good way to generate this stuff on the fly. If you know me, you know that I think the more prep that you put into a game, generally speaking, the less good the game is going to be. Or as a friend of mine named Graham Gens once said, prep is death, and I do agree with that. So the more low prep stuff that you can do, the better. But that, my dear friends, brings us to the end of this video. If you like the content that we make here at Desks and Dorks, if you feel that it has been worth your time, the single two best things that you can do are sharing this video and doing all of the YouTube pleasantries, but most importantly, if you really want to support us, if you really want to help us out in the ways that matter most, please get notified for the Kickstarter. You can do so by clicking the link in the description below or by using your phone to take a picture of the QR code that is on your screen. It is the single best way to help myself and the team over at Desks and Dorks. Even if you are not in a position to back the Kickstarter, just getting notified does bump us up in the Kickstarter algorithm, and it makes it far, far, far more likely that we will be seen by individuals who do want to support it with their money. So again, it's greatly appreciated, and I really, really do thank you for all of the stuff that you do to help us continue to push the message of TTRPGs out there and to continue to push the good message of the dad bod out there as well. But until next time, folks, I am Kyle for Desks and Dorks. Before I go, one more thing, the Q&A section will be at the end of this video, and there are quite a lot of Q&As. A lot of you folks had some great questions. But until next time, I'm Kyle for Desks and Dorks. You guys have been absolutely amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Hello, members of the Dad Bod. We did it. We made it. Well done, friends. This is the victory lap. This is the Q&A section. I love this video. This is like one of the best videos I've ever made. I'm stoked. I hope really the algorithm loves this one too. If you're still here, thanks for sticking around. This is the victory lap that we take where I answer all of your burning questions. Now, this is not going to be edited. If this is your first time here and your first time in the Q&A section, I don't edit this. This is, again, my way of blowing off steam after legitimately 12 hours of work on a single video across a couple days. So I'm going to read over some questions from the Discord and also questions from the YouTube community tab. I'm going to do my best to respond to them because a lot of times when I'm making these videos, I already have the script and everything done, or not script, because all of these videos are unscripted, by the way, which is kind of fun. That's like a little trade secret. Shh, don't tell anybody. That's edited in a different way. Maybe we'll get into that if somebody ever asks. But let's talk about the Q&A section. Peter, Tales from Elsewhere, wanted to point out, hey, what should GMs consider when it comes to water sources? So 9 times out of 10, my man, before we start getting into actual basic sanitation and sewage systems, medieval cities would have been built near naturally occurring sources of water, ponds, lakes, and rivers. I mentioned this at the beginning of the video because they're important for both trade and travel, but oh my god, most of the time, too, your source of travel and your source of trade becomes your source of toilet, which is not particularly great, and actually sort of coincides with another question that Lilliputian the Midget, which is such a strange name to say out loud, talked about with sewage systems. What were they like, and did they exist at all? Well, this is very, very interesting and very important to point out, because these two questions are created. The river is the sewage system during early medieval cities. Now, eventually that does change with the construction of simple cisterns, aqueducts, and sewer systems as time goes on. The other part of Lily's question was that is infrastructure tied to certain social classes or other parameters? And the fact of the matter is, kind of, but for the most part, not really. You could live in a more well-to-do section, kind of like you can sometimes in American cities, where infrastructure is much easier or much more well-maintained. Again, it's funny how the more things change, the more they stay the same. But for the most part, an improvement in the infrastructure of a city generally tends to be a high tide raises all ships kind of situation. Chris Bates, a longtime fan and longtime friend, mentioned, is it too big of an error to make medieval cities either too big or too small? What makes a good-sized city for believability in terms of an accurate portrayal? And the truth of the matter is, it doesn't really matter. It just depends on the type of city that you are building and the storyline that you are using. I think we did a pretty good job of talking about that and about making a city that follows the realistic parameters that you, as a game master and a storyteller, truly establish. Top 5 buildings in every city that you need to have for realism: a brothel, a church, probably another brothel, and then like a tavern. Okay, but no, seriously, you need some sort of place for sex workers. It was like just not even a foregone conclusion. Like, it's crazy how important sex work is in the formation of cities, which I know there's going to be one person who makes the end of like, this is stupid and blah, 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 blah. But like, dog, it's true, man. Human beings like to satisfy their base needs, and the base need for intercourse is one of those things. So a lot of times, the larger cities had tons of brothels. I have referred to this a couple times, but we have firsthand accounts of like a syphilis outbreak in Florence, or was it Milan? I forget which one. That is literally just reads like scenes from The Walking Dead with people's limbs like falling off, which is absolutely insane. But again, brothels were super important and incredibly critical, not just in medieval cities, but in pretty much every modern city. One of the biggest things that we found in the American West is that in many cases, the stabilizing influence in a border town in the American West was not a school or a church or a community center. It was a brothel, and the madams of the brothel usually were the ones who were sort of pushing the town forward and actually exerting order, which is really interesting and kind of crazy to think about, but it makes sense, right? Like, you don't want to get banned from the brothel. It's just like not a huge thing. Again, you do need some sort of church. You do need some sort of military installation, either for protection or to expand this town or the city's interests. You need a tavern, or in many cases, a common house or a customs house, an ale house, whatever you want to call it. A gathering center for people outside of their time, and some sort of craft area. I think that's going to be the big thing. What needs of the party should a GM always consider when you're building a city? I'm going to just say you probably shouldn't build your cities in consideration with anybody's needs, any specific needs in mind. Build them with the needs of a community in mind, and let the party sort of figure out what they do and don't need from that place as the game progresses. Salty Nick asked, how large does a city need to be to become self-sustainable? And the answer is, it depends, right? At some point, a city does hit a threshold where it struggles in certain respects. But like the example that Salty Nick brought up in his question, I'm just kind of perusing this or breezing through it, is the idea of growing their own food. But like, several different major cities did actually contribute to the food production of their own country, and as a result would have been more than self-sufficient in general. I think if you want to build a self-sufficient city, at some point you need to look at what they need. I don't think any major city is truly self-sufficient, because you hit a point where you have to import some sort of good to make it work in the long term. I will say, and I will add to that, however, that I think if you're going to build several different major cities in a game or a campaign, what you should do is you should vary what those different cities need, because I think that's going to make for a more interesting overall story by the end of the game. Are granaries more or less important than guard posts for realism? Much more important, Chris. much more important. And I would argue that brothels are probably more important than all of them, which again, it absolutely is crazy for me, but like it's not entirely false. More important than any of that stuff though is just like an overall understanding that a city is almost like a living organism, especially during these early stages of human history, where like every building, every group needs to kind of depend on the other parts of the group. And I think that's interesting. And of course, God bless America. Somebody asked, what's the ideal ratio of brothels to churches? I'm just going to say it depends on how active your monks want to get. And we're going to move on. We're going to move on from there. So again, top 5 buildings. We really did just like kind of get a little bit off base here. But top 5 buildings you should have in a city are a church, a brothel, some form of customs house or common meeting area, a military installation of some kind, and some sort of craft area or a guild area, depending on what the size of the city is. I think would be a good one. Round versus square towers, and then the later angled walls. What came first? Why did they develop? Round towers came first for the most part, or square towers. I don't think it truly matters in terms of that, but I think a more interesting concept or question is the star fort, which doesn't get properly developed till the 14 and 1500s, which does, start to change how siege warfare works. All right. I'm trying to figure out if I've got any more castles. Kavadi asked, how many murder holes are too many murder holes? I'm just going to tell you all the answer that I told him, which is as many as you can fit in and have them be feasible in order to you just unalive as many enemies as humanly possible. As long as it doesn't threaten the structural integrity of your castle, my argument would be as many murder holes as is appropriate to fend off your enemies. And with that being said, that's all the questions from the Discord, but I do have questions from our YouTube community section, which is pretty awesome. All right, I'm going to just kind of scroll through here. These are sounds that sound cool in the microphone. Okay, Ignacio. What's up, Ignacio? Longtime commenter, big fan of the channel. Thanks, man. Really appreciate it. He's wondering about the accuracies and implications for TTRPGs. We talked about the inaccuracy of a guild setting, but I like this thing where he's like, any particular thing stick out to you as inaccurate other than those guilds, which I know that I mentioned. We talked about in many cases or many of our videos, the town guard or the inability of games to get the town guard right. I think that comes out a lot. A lot of times town guards feel far more cohesive and well organized than they would have been, or have a far greater central authority than they usually would have, Ignacio. I think that's like one of the big things if I'm looking for like a sticking point. Oh, a thieves guild. Why? No. Yeah, sorry. I'm going to pop off for like 2 seconds here. The Thieves Guild is like the stupidest idea imaginable, by the way. If you run a massive criminal enterprise or a well-organized criminal enterprise and you don't want to get absolutely just destroyed by the powers that be, why would you have a single meeting place that you and all of your criminal homies hang out at? It's stupid. It's ludicrous, right? Like, it's just dumb. Like, we have examples of large gatherings of outlaws, for example, but like the idea of a thieves guild is just so dumb. Like, it's just critically dumb, because all it takes is one raid, one organization, one rat in your organization to make that whole enterprise just fall apart at the seams. I hate it. I really do. I didn't even realize how much I hated it until I started doing these videos. So Ignacio, that's definitely it. And which odd or known jobs? This is by Sir Horseshoe McGee. Sir, which odd or not much known jobs or aspects are missing in RPG cities when compared to medieval ones? Which ones are overused? We talked, of course, about the guild district. I think that one's super overused. I just mentioned the Thieves Guild. Get that weak crap the heck out of here. But again, in terms of ones that are missing, I think one of the things that is really interesting, this will be the last of the Q&A things that I go over, is the tanners section. So a tanner was somebody who would make leather, usually by curing it, which again, by curing animal hide, or in some cases even human skin. And the process by which one would cure leather or tan leather is a pretty gross one. So in the early Middle Ages and even into the Renaissance, you would just use human urine as a way to sort of cure this leather. And so tanning districts or tanning areas, a tanner's guild, often just reeked of human piss. which is kind of a weird thing to think about. But I bring this up because it was an essential job. Leather was a well-used and very important substance to have access to. It was essential for binding books, for garments, for armor, for equipment, for just like all manner of things that were used in the Middle Ages. But one of the most common sources of income if you were a poorer individual in a city was you would take your chamber pot, or in some cases a bucket, you would fill it with your urine, and you would bring it to the tanner, who would then buy your urine at a rate depending on how much urine you brought them, which, by the way, is where we get the etymology of the term. We were too poor, we didn't even have a pot to piss in, because the poorest of the poor in these cities were so destitute that they lacked a vessel by which to literally just excrete their bodily fluids into and then sell those to the tanners. This is an unused thing, and again, it's gross. I get why people don't use it, but it's one of the fascinating little tidbits about medieval and Renaissance life that I think is really interesting and intriguing. There's quite a lot of stuff that is kind of in that grody sort of range that I think gets left out because it's like, it's not fun or cutesy, it doesn't fit the fantasy theme. It's like, yeah, but these were real jobs that real people had, and I think they sort of lend a nice, not nice, but sort of lend an interesting, or at the very least compelling texture to the worlds that we build. That's pretty much it for the questions. This was a really long Q&A this time, which is great. I think I'm going to start doing this a little more often, where I post stuff to the Discord as well as the YouTube comments. Usually people will post their initial questions in the beginning of my editing and not scripting. I don't really know what else to call it, but I'm going to call it scripting process. But again, this was the first time I asked for these questions as the video was being finished up, so I kind of had a better idea of what was and wasn't going to be included, and I think a lot more people had time to chime in, so I think I will do that again. And that's it for Q&As. Go support the Kickstarter if you can. I'm not gonna go back. We're too far in. I just wanted to keep the images scrolling so you guys had something cool to look at. But yeah, support the Kickstarter if you can, if it's financially available for you to do so, and expedient for you to do so. Remember, if you can't do it, then don't worry about it. Go support your friendly local game store if they're good people and you want to support them. That's super critical too. We love friendly local game stores. Please make sure that if you've got a friendly local game store, you support them. If they don't carry Desks and Dorks games, tell me. I will talk to them and see if they want to carry Desks and Dorks games, because the more friendly local game stores we can help, the better. But that's pretty much it, folks. You guys are great. Thank you again to everybody that has blown us up. Man, we're almost at 7K subscribers already, which is just wild. Literally, this is this month, after this month, it will have been 1 year that I really started to take this seriously, which is crazy. So, yeah, I really appreciate it. But yeah, I'm Kyle out for Desks and Dorks. You guys are great. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.